The roar of jet engines at dawn has a way of separating dreamers from pilots. At Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, where the desert heat shimmers off the tarmac like liquid metal, Captain Sarah "Phoenix" Martinez stood beside her F-16 Fighting Falcon, running through her pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision that had become her trademark. But as she traced her gloved fingers along the aircraft's sleek fuselage, she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. Today would test everything she'd fought for, everything she'd proven, and everything she still had to prove. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Martinez hadn't always been destined for the cockpit of a fighter jet. Growing up in a small town in New Mexico, she was the daughter of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, neither of whom had ever imagined their quiet, studious daughter would one day be pulling 7 Gs at 30,000 feet. But Sarah had always been drawn to the sky. As a child, she would lie on her back in the desert, watching contrails streak across the endless blue, wondering what it would feel like to paint those white lines herself. The path to becoming a fighter pilot is brutal under the best circumstances. For Sarah, it was a gauntlet of skepticism, condescension, and outright hostility. When she entered the Air Force Academy in 2008, women had only recently been allowed in combat roles, and the old guard wasn't ready to welcome her with open arms. Her classmates whispered that she was there to fill a quota. Her instructors pushed her twice as hard, expecting her to fail. Even her flight suit seemed designed to remind her she didn't belong, baggy in all the wrong places, a constant physical reminder that this world had been built for someone else. But Sarah Martinez was not someone who crumbled under pressure. If anything, doubt fueled her. Every snide comment, every rolled eye, every suggestion that maybe she'd be better suited for transport aircraft or UAV operations only made her more determined to earn her place in the cockpit of the military's most advanced fighter. She graduated third in her class from pilot training, earned her wings with distinction, and was eventually assigned to the 64th Aggressor Squadron at Nellis, an elite unit that trained other pilots by simulating enemy aircraft and tactics. Even there, surrounded by some of the best pilots in the world, Sarah faced an uphill battle. Squadron leader Colonel Mike "Hammer" Thompson, a 20-year veteran with more combat hours than most pilots would ever dream of, made no secret of his reservations. "She's technically proficient," he would tell other officers over beers at the O Club, "but she lacks the killer instinct. Fighter pilots need to be predators, and she's just too careful." The other pilots in the squadron weren't openly hostile, but they weren't exactly welcoming either. Captain Jake "Viper" Stevens, the squadron's golden boy, had a habit of forgetting to include Sarah in their informal debriefs. Captain Lisa "Torch" Wang, one of only 2 other women in the unit, seemed to go out of her way to avoid any appearance of solidarity. And Captain Marcus "Razor" Johnson treated Sarah with the kind of professional courtesy that somehow felt more insulting than outright rudeness. But perhaps the most frustrating aspect of Sarah's situation wasn't the overt skepticism, it was the way her competence was consistently minimized. When she executed a perfect intercept during a training mission, it was because the scenario was too easy. When she outmaneuvered an experienced pilot in a dogfight simulation, it was because she got lucky. When she completed her weapons qualifications ahead of schedule, it was because the instructors were going easy on her. Every success was explained away, every achievement diminished. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She had worked harder than almost anyone to reach this point, had sacrificed more, had proven herself time and again, yet she was still fighting for respect that seemed to come automatically to her male counterparts. She had logged over 2,000 flight hours, had completed advanced fighter tactics courses, had even done a tour in Afghanistan flying close air support missions, but none of that mattered when it came to how she was perceived by her peers. What made it even more challenging was that Sarah genuinely loved what she did. Flying wasn't just her job, it was her passion, her calling, the thing that made her feel most alive. When she was in the cockpit, pulling G's and dancing through the sky at supersonic speeds, all the politics and prejudice fell away. Up there, physics didn't care about gender. The laws of aerodynamics were colorblind and gender neutral. Up there, Sarah Martinez wasn't a woman pilot or a diversity hire or any of the other labels that seemed to follow her around on the ground. She was just a pilot, and she was damn good at it. But being good at something and being recognized for being good at something are two very different things. And as Sarah stood on the tarmac that morning in March 2019, preparing for what was supposed to be a routine training mission, she carried with her the weight of constant scrutiny, the burden of representation, and the quiet determination to prove, once and for all, that she belonged in that cockpit.
The briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base buzzed with the familiar energy of another training day. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across detailed mission charts, and weather reports spread across metal tables. The smell of burnt coffee and aviation fuel seemed permanently embedded in the walls, mixing with the underlying tension that always accompanied high-stakes flight operations. Colonel Thompson stood at the front of the room, his weathered face bearing the kind of deep lines that come from decades of squinting into bright cockpits and making split-second decisions at altitude. Behind him, a large screen displayed the day's training scenario, a complex air-to-air engagement simulation designed to test the pilot's ability to adapt to rapidly changing tactical situations. "Gentlemen and lady," Thompson began, the slight pause before acknowledging Sarah's presence, feeling both deliberate and dismissive. "Today's exercise is designated Red Flag 19-2, Phase 3. We'll be running a contested environment scenario with multiple threat vectors and electronic countermeasures." Sarah sat in the third row, her flight suit crisp and her notepad ready, listening intently as Thompson outlined the mission parameters. The scenario was indeed complex. A simulated enemy airfield with multiple surface-to-air missile sites, electronic jamming, and a squadron of adversary aircraft playing the role of hostile fighters. The Blue Force, consisting of 6 F-16s from the 64th Aggressor Squadron, would attempt to penetrate enemy airspace and engage targets of opportunity. "Phoenix," Thompson's voice cut through Sarah's concentration, using her call sign with the same tone he might use to discuss a minor maintenance issue. "You'll be flying as Blue 4, wingman to Razor's Element. Your primary objective is to maintain formation integrity and provide defensive support." The assignment stung. Blue 4 was typically the most junior position in the flight, reserved for new pilots still learning the ropes. Sarah had been in the squadron for over a year and had more flight hours than half the pilots in the room, yet she was still being relegated to a support role. She caught Captain Johnson's slight smirk from across the room. He would be leaving our element as Blue 3, making him her flight lead despite having similar flight experience levels. "Weather conditions are forecast to be challenging," Thompson continued, advancing to the next slide. "We've got a low-pressure system moving through the area with variable cloud cover, possible wind shear at altitude, and scattered thunderstorm activity. Visibility could deteriorate rapidly, so stay sharp and maintain constant communication." Major Patricia Ice Fernandez, the squadron's operations officer, took over the briefing to discuss rules of engagement and safety protocols. Ice was one of the few senior officers who treated Sarah with genuine respect, having fought similar battles during her own rise through the ranks. "Remember," she emphasized, "this is a training exercise, but we're operating in complex airspace with civilian traffic. Maintain strict altitude discipline and follow all safety of flight procedures." As the briefing continued, Sarah found herself thinking about the subtle dynamics at play in the room. When Captain Stevens asked a technical question about the enemy's simulated radar capabilities, Thompson's response was detailed and respectful. When Captain Wang sought clarification about the communications plan, she received a thorough explanation. But when Sarah had raised a concern about potential weather-related visibility issues during the mission planning phase the day before, Thompson had dismissed it with a curt, "We'll adapt as needed." The pattern was so consistent, so pervasive, that Sarah sometimes wondered if she was imagining it, but then she would catch the looks exchanged between some of the male pilots, or notice how conversations seemed to pause when she approached, or observe how her suggestions and flight debriefs were often attributed to other pilots when they appeared in official reports. "Equipment status," Thompson announced, moving to the final phase of the briefing. "All equipment is mission-capable with full defensive systems and simulated weapons loads. Maintenance is signed off on all jets, and we have clear weather for takeoff and initial climb-out." Sarah's aircraft, tail number 910342, was one of the squadron's newer F-16C Block 50 models, equipped with advanced avionics and the latest defensive countermeasures. She had flown this particular jet several times before and knew its quirks: a slight tendency to pull left during high-G maneuvers, a hydraulic system that occasionally showed false warning indicators, and an ejection seat that required an extra half-inch of adjustment to accommodate her shorter stature. As the briefing concluded and pilots began filing out to begin their pre-flight preparations, Sarah felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and frustration. The anticipation came from the pure joy of flying, the chance to once again slip the bonds of Earth and enter the three-dimensional chess game of aerial combat. The frustration stemmed from knowing that no matter how well she performed, no matter how perfectly she executed every maneuver or how precisely she followed every protocol, there would always be someone ready to explain away her success or minimize her contribution. Captain Wang fell into step beside Sarah as they walked toward the equipment room. "Challenging scenario today," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Nothing we haven't handled before," Sarah replied, wondering if this was the beginning of a rare moment of solidarity or just polite conversation. "True," Wang agreed, then lowered her voice slightly. "Just be extra careful out there. The weather's more unstable than they're letting on, and with all the electronic jamming in the scenario, navigation could get tricky." It was the closest thing to advice or support Sarah had received from another pilot in weeks, and she felt a small surge of gratitude. "Thanks, Torch. I'll keep my eyes open." As they suited up in their flight gear, G-suits, survival vests, helmets, and oxygen masks, Sarah ran through her mental checklist one final time. Everything felt routine. Everything felt normal. In less than an hour, she would be airborne, doing what she loved most in the world. She had no way of knowing that this routine training mission would become the defining moment of her career, the test that would finally prove to everyone, including herself, exactly what Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez was capable of when everything went wrong.
The pre-dawn air at Nellis carried the crisp bite of desert morning, tinged with the acrid smell of jet fuel and the metallic scent of aircraft aluminum warming in the early sunlight. Sarah's boots clicked rhythmically against the tarmac as she approached her assigned F-16, tail number 910342, its sleek profile casting a long shadow across the flight line. The aircraft sat like a coiled predator, 32,000 pounds of precisely engineered metal, composites, and electronics designed for one purpose: air superiority. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, her dedicated crew chief, was already waiting beside the aircraft with a tablet full of maintenance logs and system checks. Rodriguez had been maintaining F-16s for 12 years and had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect potential problems before they became actual problems. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he guided Sarah through the pre-flight inspection. "She's been good to us, Captain," Rodriguez said, patting the aircraft's nose with the kind of affection reserved for reliable machines. "All systems checked out green during the morning inspection. We replaced a faulty pitot tube yesterday and calibrated the attitude indicator, so your flight instrument should be rock solid." Sarah nodded, beginning her own visual inspection of the aircraft. This was more than just standard protocol. It was a ritual, a way of connecting with the machine that would soon be carrying her life in its aluminum hands. She checked the control surfaces, ensuring the ailerons, elevators, and rudder moved freely through their full range of motion. She examined the landing gear struts for hydraulic leaks, inspected the intake engine for any foreign object debris that could cause catastrophic damage during flight, and verified that all external panels were properly secured. The
The F-16 was a marvel of engineering, a single-engine, multi-role fighter that had earned its reputation as one of the world's most capable combat aircraft, but it was also unforgiving. Unlike larger twin-engine fighters, the F-16 provided no backup if its single Pratt & Whitney F-110 turbofan engine failed. Every system had to work perfectly. Every component had to function as designed, because there were no second chances at 30,000 feet. Fuel load is 7,000 pounds, Rodriguez said, reading from his checklist. Oil quantity is good, hydraulic pressure is nominal, and all defensive systems are operational. The AGM-65 Maverick simulators are loaded and armed for today's exercise. Sarah completed her external inspection and climbed the ladder to the cockpit. The F-16's cockpit was a symphony of switches, displays, and instruments, each one representing years of technological development and operational refinement. The pilot's seat was positioned under a single-piece bubble canopy that provided nearly 360-degree visibility, a crucial advantage in air-to-air combat where seeing your opponent first could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Settling into the ejection seat, Sarah began the meticulous process of strapping herself in. The seat harness wasn't just a safety device, it was a connection to the aircraft's ejection system, designed to launch pilot and seat clear of the aircraft in less than 2 seconds if catastrophic failure required emergency escape. She adjusted the leg restraints, tightened the shoulder straps, and connected the various life support systems that would keep her alive if the worst happened. The cockpit came alive as Sarah began the engine start sequence. Switches flipped in precise order, displays illuminated with cascading information, and the aircraft's computer systems began their automated self-tests. The heads-up display projected critical flight data onto the bulletproof windscreen, while the multifunction displays showed engine parameters, navigation information, and tactical data. Nellis ground, Phoenix with information Delta, request taxi. Sarah transmitted over the radio, her voice clear and professional despite the anticipation building in her chest. Nellis ground, Phoenix, taxi to runway 21 left via taxiway Alpha. Hold short of the active runway. Winds are 210 at 12 knots, gusting to 18. As Sarah taxied toward the runway, the other 5 aircraft in her flight were completing similar preparations. Captain Johnson's F-16 was positioned directly ahead of her, its engine's distinctive whine mixing with her own aircraft sounds to create the familiar symphony of military aviation. Through her canopy, she could see the other pilots running through their final checks, each one focused on the complex dance of man and machine that was about to begin. The taxiway at Nellis was a river of concrete surrounded by the infrastructure of one of the world's most advanced military training facilities. Hangars stretched toward the distant mountains, their massive doors open to reveal more aircraft in various stages of maintenance and preparation. Ground crews moved with purposeful efficiency, their bright yellow and green safety vests creating splashes of color against the neutral desert landscape. Phoenix, you're cleared onto the active runway. Hold for departure control, came the call from the tower controller. Sarah guided her F-16 into position on the runway centerline, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded every takeoff. Behind her, the Pratt & Whitney engine was producing 29,000 pounds of thrust, enough power to accelerate her 16-ton aircraft from 0 to 200 miles per hour in less than 20 seconds. The runway stretched ahead like a concrete river, its far end shimmering in the morning heat. Flight of 6 F-16s, you are cleared for takeoff. Maintain runway heading until advised. Contact departure control on 327.4. Good hunting. Sarah pushed the throttle forward to military power, feeling the aircraft strain against its wheel brakes like a thoroughbred at the starting gate. The engine note climbed from a whine to a roar as thousands of pounds of thrust pushed against the airframe. She released the brakes and felt the immediate acceleration press her back into the ejection seat. The F-16 gathered speed with startling rapidity. At 150 knots, Sarah eased back on the stick, feeling the nose gear lift off the runway. At 165 knots, the main gear left the ground, and tail number 910342 was airborne, climbing toward the Nevada sky with the graceful power that had made the Fighting Falcon legendary. As the ground fell away beneath her, she felt the familiar transformation from earthbound human to aerial predator. The cockpit became an extension of her body, the aircraft's control surfaces responding to her slightest input. This was where she belonged, where doubt and skepticism fell away like discarded equipment, where only skill and instinct mattered. She had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, this routine training flight would become a nightmare scenario that would test every aspect of her training, her courage, and her determination to survive.
At 15,000 feet above the Nevada desert, the 6 F-16 Fighting Falcons of Red Flag 19-2 formed a loose tactical formation, their gray-painted fuselages blending seamlessly with the scattered clouds that dotted the morning sky. Sarah held her position as Blue 4, maintaining precise spacing behind Captain Johnson's aircraft while constantly scanning the airspace around her formation. The radio chatter was minimal, professional pilots communicating in the clipped, efficient language that had evolved over decades of aerial warfare. "Blue Flight, this is lead," Colonel Thompson's voice came over the tactical frequency. "We're approaching the initial point. Expect first contact with red air in approximately 8 minutes. Weather ahead looks marginal. We've got some buildups at our 12 o'clock that could complicate the engagement." Sarah could see the towering cumulus clouds Thompson was referring to, their billowing white tops reaching toward 25,000 feet like massive cotton fortresses. The weather briefing had mentioned possible thunderstorm activity, but the reality was more dramatic than the meteorologists had predicted. Lightning flickered inside the distant clouds, and Sarah could see the telltale signs of severe turbulence in the way the cloud formations shifted and morphed. "Blue 3, Blue 4, maintain close formation through the weather." Captain Johnson's voice crackled through her headset. "We might hit some chop, so stay sharp." Sarah acknowledged the transmission and tightened her formation position, bringing her F-16 closer to Johnson's aircraft. Flying in close formation through turbulence required absolute concentration and smooth control inputs. Any sudden movement or overcorrection could result in a mid-air collision, turning a training exercise into a life-and-death struggle for survival in seconds. The first wisps of cloud began to stream past her canopy as the formation entered the edge of the weather system. Visibility dropped from unlimited to less than a mile as they punched through layers of moisture and wind shear. Sarah's aircraft bucked and rolled in the turbulent air, the G-forces alternately pressing her into her seat and lifting her against her harness restraints. Through her headset, she could hear the increasingly tense communications between aircraft as pilots struggled to maintain formation in the deteriorating conditions. "Blue 2, you're drifting left," came one transmission. "Blue 5, close it up," came another. The professional calm in their voices belied the physical demands of flying precision formation through severe turbulence. Suddenly, the formation burst through the cloud layer into brilliant sunlight, and Sarah felt her breath catch at the sight before them. The Nevada landscape stretched out below like a vast brown and tan tapestry, cut by the silver thread of Interstate 15 and dotted with the geometric patterns of military training ranges. But her attention was immediately drawn to the electronic warfare display on her multifunction display, which was lighting up like a Christmas tree with threat warnings. "Multiple contacts bearing 090, altitude unknown," announced Captain Stevens from his position as Blue 2. "I'm showing at least 4 bandits, possibly more. Recommend we split into elements and engage." This was the moment Sarah had been training for, the complex, three-dimensional chess game of modern air combat. The enemy aircraft were actually F-16s from other squadrons, painted in different color schemes and equipped with electronic pods that simulated hostile radar and missile systems. But the tactics, the split-second decision-making, and the physical demands were identical to real combat. "Blue Flight, this is lead. Execute Plan Alpha. Elements split north and south. Maintain altitude separation of 2,000 feet. Blue 3 and 4 take the southern group." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as Johnson banked their element hard to the right, diving toward a lower altitude where they could use the terrain to mask their approach. This was more responsibility than she had been given in previous exercises, real tactical maneuvering where her decisions and actions would directly impact the mission's success. "Phoenix, stay with me," Johnson transmitted on their discrete frequency. "We're going to come up under them and try to get a shot with the AMRAAMs before they detect us." The AMRAAM, Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Weapon, was the F-16's primary beyond-visual range weapon, capable of engaging targets at distances of over 60 miles.
In this training scenario, the missiles were simulated, but the tactics and engagement procedures were identical to combat operations. Sarah adjusted her position slightly to optimize her radar coverage, while Johnson maneuvered their element into an attack position. Through her canopy, she could see the enemy aircraft several miles ahead, their contrails drawing lazy circles in the sky as they searched for the incoming blue force. "I've got lock on the lead bandit," announced Johnson. "Phoenix, take the trailer. On my mark, we'll engage simultaneously." Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision across her cockpit controls, selecting the appropriate weapon system and designating her target on the radar display. Her heart rate had increased, but her breathing remained steady, the result of countless hours of training and simulation. The HUD displayed tracking information, showing her target's speed, altitude, and bearing with digital precision. Good lock, she transmitted as her fire control system achieved missile lock-on. "Phoenix ready to engage." Stand by, Fox 3! Johnson's simulated missile shot was followed immediately by Sarah's own engagement. "Fox 3, Phoenix," she called out, indicating her own missile launch. But as the simulated engagement played out on their displays, Sarah noticed something troubling on her aircraft systems panel. A small yellow caution light had illuminated next to her electrical system display. Not an immediate emergency, but something that required attention. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She glanced at the electrical system readout and saw that her main generator was showing fluctuating voltage, not outside normal parameters, but trending in a direction that could indicate a developing problem. Military aircraft were designed with multiple redundant systems, and a single generator issue was typically manageable. But something about the pattern of the fluctuation concerned her. "Blue 3, Phoenix," she transmitted to Johnson. "I'm showing some electrical anomalies. Nothing critical yet, but I recommend we stay close to base in case this develops into a serious problem." Johnson's response was immediate and professional. "Copy, Phoenix. We'll complete this engagement and then head home. Keep me posted on your system status." As their simulated missiles found their targets and the exercise controllers called the engagement complete, Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction of a successful mission. Her shot had been clean, her formation flying had been precise, and her target had been neutralized according to the scoring system. But the electrical anomaly continued to nag at her consciousness. Unknown to Sarah, deep within her electrical system, a critical wire harness was beginning to chafe against a structural bracket. The insulation had been worn thin by months of vibration and temperature cycling, and with each passing minute of flight time, the copper conductors beneath were coming closer to making contact with the aircraft's aluminum structure. When that contact finally occurred, it would trigger a cascade of electrical failures that would transform a routine training flight into a life-and-death struggle for survival.
The first real indication that something was seriously wrong came as Sarah's F-16 was climbing back to altitude after the simulated engagement. She had just leveled off at 18,000 feet when her master caution light illuminated, followed immediately by a cascade of warning tones that filled her headset with urgent electronic bleeps and chimes. "Phoenix, Blue 3, Captain Johnson's voice cut through the cacophony of alarms. "What's your status? I see you've got some warning lights." Sarah's eyes swept across her instrument panel with trained efficiency, trying to process the multiple system failures that seemed to be occurring simultaneously. Her electrical system display now showed red warnings, her hydraulic pressure was fluctuating wildly, and several of her flight instruments were beginning to show erratic readings. "Blue 3, Phoenix," she replied, working to keep her voice steady despite the growing concern in her chest. "I'm showing multiple system failures. Electrical, hydraulic, and some flight instruments are acting up, requesting vectors to the nearest suitable airfield." What Sarah couldn't see was the electrical fire that had started behind her instrument panel. The chafed wire harness had finally made contact with the aircraft's structure, creating a short circuit that was now spreading through her F-16's complex electrical system like a digital plague. The fire suppression system was trying to contain the damage, but the location of the short circuit made it nearly impossible to isolate. Phoenix, this is Lead, Colonel Thompson's voice came over the radio, his earlier skepticism replaced by professional concern. We're showing you at 18,000 feet, approximately 40 miles northeast of Nellis. What's the nature of your emergency? Sarah was already running through her emergency checklists, her hands moving quickly but deliberately across switches and circuit breakers as she tried to isolate the failing systems. The F-16's design philosophy emphasized simplicity and reliability, but when multiple systems began failing simultaneously, even the most experienced pilots could be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information and decisions required. Lead, Phoenix, she transmitted, her voice tight with concentration. I've lost my primary electrical generator. Backup generator is intermittent. Hydraulic system alpha is showing zero pressure, and I'm getting false readings from multiple flight instruments. The aircraft is still flyable, but I'm losing systems rapidly. The words still flyable were both accurate and desperately optimistic. The F-16 could theoretically continue operating with various system failures, but the combination of electrical and hydraulic problems Sarah was experiencing was pushing the aircraft toward the edge of controllability. Without hydraulic pressure, her control surfaces would become increasingly heavy and unresponsive. Without electrical power, her flight instruments would fail, leaving her flying blind in an aircraft moving at nearly 400 miles per hour. Phoenix, Lead copies. We're declaring an emergency for your aircraft. Nellis Tower is being notified and emergency equipment is being positioned. Can you maintain current altitude and airspeed? Sarah tested her flight controls, feeling the stick becoming noticeably heavier as hydraulic pressure continued to drop. The F-16's manual reversion system would allow her to maintain some control even with complete hydraulic failure, but it would require significantly more physical strength and would be far less precise than normal. Affirmative on altitude and airspeed for now, but I can feel the controls getting heavier. I don't think I have much time before this gets critical. In the Nellis Air Traffic Control Tower, controllers were already coordinating Sarah's emergency approach. Fire trucks were rolling toward the runway, medical personnel were being alerted, and other aircraft in the area were being vectored away to clear the airspace. Emergency procedures that had been practiced hundreds of times were now being executed with the knowledge that a pilot's life hung in the balance. But Sarah's situation was about to become dramatically worse. As she began her descent toward Nellis, the electrical fire that had been smoldering behind her instrument panel suddenly flared, fueled by the aircraft's oxygen system. The flames, invisible to Sarah but detected by the aircraft's fire warning systems, began consuming critical wiring bundles that controlled everything from her flight instruments to her landing gear. "Warning! Warning! Fire!" announced the aircraft's automated voice warning system. "Engine fire! Engine fire!" Sarah's blood ran cold. An engine fire in a single-engine fighter was about as serious as emergencies got. Without her engine, the F-16 would become a 16-ton glider with the aerodynamic characteristics of a brick. She had perhaps minutes, maybe less, before she would be forced to eject or attempt a dead-stick landing. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," she transmitted, using the international distress call that would give her priority over all other radio traffic. "Phoenix, declaring emergency. I have an engine fire warning and multiple system failures, requesting immediate vectors to Nellis for emergency landing." Her hands flew to the engine fire emergency procedure, shutting down fuel flow and activating the aircraft's fire suppression system. But as she pulled the engine master switch to the off position, she realized with growing horror that the fire warning was not from her engine at all. It was from the electrical fire that was now consuming her aircraft's internal systems. "Phoenix, Nellis approach," came a new voice over the radio, the emergency controller who would guide her through the next critical minutes. "We have you on radar at 15,000 feet, 35 miles northeast. Turn left heading 240, descend and maintain 10,000. Emergency equipment is standing by." As Sarah began her descent toward Nellis, she felt the aircraft shudder slightly, not from turbulence, but from the structural stress of flying with compromised systems. Her airspeed indicator was fluctuating wildly, her altitude readings were inconsistent, and her attitude indicator had begun to tumble, showing her in a spiral dive when she knew she was flying straight and level. "I'm losing my flight instruments," she reported, her voice steady but
despite the fear that was beginning to gnaw at her stomach. Attitude indicator is tumbling, airspeed is unreliable, and my altitude readings don't match what you're showing on radar.
Flying without reliable instruments was challenging enough in perfect weather conditions, but the Nevada sky was beginning to show signs of the severe weather that had been forecast, with visibility dropping and wind conditions becoming increasingly turbulent. Sarah was about to face every pilot's nightmare, flying a crippled aircraft through deteriorating weather with no reliable way to determine her aircraft's attitude, altitude, or airspeed. The moment that would define Sarah Martinez's career and possibly her life came without warning or ceremony. She was descending through 12,000 feet, still 28 miles from Nellis Air Force Base, when every electrical system in her F-16 simultaneously went dark. The fire that had been consuming her aircraft's wiring had finally reached the main electrical distribution panel, severing the connections that provided power to everything from her flight instruments to her radio systems. In an instant, Sarah's modern high-tech fighter jet became a powerless glider hurtling through the sky at nearly 350 miles per hour. Her multifunction displays went black, her heads-up display disappeared, and even her emergency lighting failed to illuminate. The only sounds in the cockpit were the whistle of wind over the canopy and the distant rumble of her engine, which was still running despite having no electronic engine controls. "Nellis approach Phoenix," she transmitted, but received only static in response. Her radio was as dead as everything else that depended on electrical power. She was now truly alone, flying a crippled aircraft with no way to communicate with the outside world and no reliable instruments to tell her which way was up. The immediate challenge was maintaining controlled flight without her attitude indicator, the instrument that showed her aircraft's orientation relative to the horizon. In good weather with unlimited visibility, this might have been manageable. A pilot could use visual references to maintain level flight. But the Nevada sky was rapidly deteriorating, with layers of clouds reducing visibility and making it increasingly difficult to distinguish between sky and ground. Sarah fell back on her most basic flying skills, using the seat of her pants and her inner ear to sense the aircraft's attitude and motion. She could feel the slight pressure against her body when the aircraft banked or climbed, could sense the subtle changes in G-force that indicated turns or altitude changes. But these sensations were imprecise and could be dangerously misleading, especially in turbulent conditions or when stress and adrenaline affected her perception. Without electrical power, her hydraulic systems were also beginning to fail. The F-16's flight control surfaces, the ailerons, elevators, and rudder that controlled the aircraft's movement, were becoming increasingly heavy and unresponsive. What had once required light fingertip pressure on the control stick now demanded significant physical effort. Sarah could feel the strain in her arms and shoulders as she fought to maintain control of the aircraft. The most critical issue, however, was navigation. Without her GPS system, radio navigation aids, or even a compass that she could trust, she had no reliable way to determine her exact position or heading. She knew she had been roughly 30 miles northeast of Nellis when her systems failed, but at 350 miles per hour, that position was changing rapidly. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, with few distinctive landmarks visible from altitude through the increasing cloud cover. Sarah forced herself to think systematically despite the cascade of failures threatening to overwhelm her. First priority, maintain controlled flight and prevent the aircraft from entering a spin or unrecoverable attitude. Second priority, determine her approximate position and heading. Third priority, find a suitable place to land. Preferably Nellis, but any runway would do at this point. She glanced at her fuel gauge, one of the few instruments that was mechanically driven and still functioning. The needle showed approximately 3,500 pounds of fuel remaining, enough for perhaps 20 minutes of flight time, depending on her power settings and altitude. 20 minutes to save her life and prove to everyone, including herself, that she belonged in this cockpit. The irony wasn't lost on her that all the skepticism and doubt she had faced throughout her career had led to this moment. Every questioning look, every dismissive comment,
every suggestion that she wasn't cut out for fighter aviation, had prepared her for a situation where there was nowhere to hide, no one else to rely on, and no room for error. This was the ultimate test of everything she had learned, everything she had trained for, and everything she was capable of. Looking outside the cockpit, Sarah tried to establish visual references that could help her navigate. The sun was still visible through breaks in the clouds, providing a rough sense of direction. Interstate 15, the main highway between Las Vegas and Salt Lake City, should be visible somewhere to her west. If she could spot the highway, she could use it as a navigation reference to guide her toward Las Vegas and the multiple airports in that area. But as she scanned the landscape below, Sarah realized that her situation was even more precarious than she had initially thought. The clouds were thickening rapidly, and what had been scattered coverage was becoming a solid overcast. Visibility was dropping from miles to mere hundreds of yards in some areas, and the turbulence was becoming severe enough to make precise aircraft control nearly impossible. The physical demands of flying the F-16 without hydraulic assistance were beginning to take their toll. Sarah's arms and shoulders ached from the constant pressure required to maintain control, and she could feel sweat beginning to bead on her forehead despite the cool temperature at altitude. The aircraft wanted to roll to the right due to a slight asymmetry in its control surfaces, requiring constant left aileron pressure to maintain level flight. More concerning was the way the aircraft was beginning to respond, or failed to respond to her control inputs. The delay between moving the stick and seeing a change in the aircraft's attitude was increasing, suggesting that her remaining hydraulic systems were continuing to degrade. Soon she might be down to purely mechanical control, which would make precision flying nearly impossible. Sarah's mind raced through her emergency procedures training. The F-16 had been designed to be controllable even with complete hydraulic failure, but that assumed good weather conditions and a pilot who was dealing with multiple simultaneous emergencies. The combination of systems failures she was experiencing was beyond anything covered in normal training scenarios. She tried to estimate her current position based on time and distance traveled since her last known location. If she had been flying roughly southwest since her systems failed, and if her ground speed was approximately 300 knots, accounting for wind effects, she should be somewhere in the vicinity of Las Vegas. But somewhere in the vicinity wasn't precise enough when she needed to find a specific runway in deteriorating weather conditions. The clouds suddenly parted for a moment, giving Sarah a brief glimpse of the terrain below. She could see what appeared to be a major highway running north-south, with the sprawling urban area of Las Vegas visible in the distance through the haze. Relief flooded through her as she realized she had a visual reference point that could guide her toward multiple potential landing sites. But her relief was short-lived. As she looked more carefully at her aircraft's performance, Sarah noticed that her engine was beginning to run roughly. Without electronic engine controls, the sophisticated computer systems that normally optimized fuel flow and engine parameters were offline. The engine was essentially running in a degraded manual mode, and she could feel irregular vibrations through the airframe that suggested possible engine problems. An engine failure now would be catastrophic. Without thrust, the F-16 would become a glider with terrible gliding characteristics, capable of perhaps 10 or 12 miles of forward distance for every mile of altitude lost. From her current altitude of approximately 10,000 feet, that would give her perhaps 100 miles of gliding distance, if she could maintain optimal gliding speed and if the weather conditions didn't force her into energy-wasting maneuvering. Sarah's training had covered engine failure scenarios extensively, but always with the assumption that her flight instruments would be working and that she would have radio contact with air traffic control. Flying a dead-stick approach in an F-16 with no instruments and no radio contact was a scenario that existed only in the realm of nightmares and worst-case training exercises. The engine vibration was becoming more pronounced, and Sarah could see fluctuations in her fuel flow indicator that suggested the engine's mechanical fuel control system was struggling to maintain stable operation. She had perhaps minutes before a complete engine failure became inevitable, and she was still over 15 miles from the nearest suitable runway. As the clouds closed in around her aircraft once again, reducing visibility to near zero, Sarah Martinez faced the ultimate test of her skills, her training, and her determination to survive. Everything she had worked for, everything she had proven, and everything she still hoped to prove hung in the balance of the next few critical minutes.
Flying blind through the Nevada clouds, Sarah Martinez faced the kind of decision that no amount of training could fully prepare her for. With her engine running increasingly rough and her aircraft becoming harder to control by the minute, she had to choose between attempting to reach a major airport with long runways and emergency equipment, or finding a closer but less suitable landing site before her situation became completely impossible. Through brief breaks in the cloud cover, she could make out the sprawling lights of Las Vegas in the distance, its familiar grid of streets and the distinctive line of casino hotels along the strip, providing unmistakable landmarks. McCarran International Airport, now known as Harry Reid International, lays somewhere in that urban maze, with its 14,000-foot runways and full emergency response capabilities. But it was still at least 20 miles away, and 20 miles might as well have been 200 given her aircraft's deteriorating condition. Closer to her current position, Sarah could make out what appeared to be a smaller airfield, possibly North Las Vegas Airport or one of the other general aviation facilities that dotted the Las Vegas Valley. These airports would have shorter runways, no military emergency equipment, and air traffic controllers who might not be prepared for an emergency F-16 landing. But they were achievable, and in her current situation, achievable was beginning to matter more than ideal. The decision was complicated by another factor that Sarah was trying not to think about: the ejection seat. Every military pilot knew that ejecting from an aircraft was always an option, and in many emergency situations, it was the safest choice. The F-16's ACES II ejection seat was designed to save pilot lives in exactly these kinds of scenarios, capable of safely extracting her from the aircraft at almost any altitude and airspeed. But ejecting meant abandoning her aircraft, and Sarah wasn't ready to give up yet. More than that, ejecting felt like admitting defeat, validating every doubt that had been expressed about her capabilities. She'd spent her entire career proving that she belonged in fighter cockpits, and walking away from this challenge, even for perfectly valid safety reasons, would feel like surrendering everything she had worked for. The engine vibration was becoming severe enough that Sarah could feel it through the entire airframe. Her fuel flow indicator was fluctuating wildly, and she was beginning to see indications of an impending engine failure. The Pratt & Whitney F-110 that powered her F-16 was one of the most reliable engines ever built. But it wasn't designed to operate without its sophisticated electronic controls, and the stress of running in degraded mode was beginning to tell. Sarah made her decision. She would attempt to reach North Las Vegas Airport, which appeared to be roughly 8 miles away and had at least one runway long enough to accommodate an F-16 landing. It wasn't ideal. The runway was shorter than she would have preferred, and she would be landing at an unfamiliar airport without radio contact or emergency services specifically equipped for military aircraft. But it was within reach, and that made it her best option. The descent toward North Las Vegas Airport required precise energy management without the benefit of reliable instruments. Sarah had to balance airspeed, altitude, and distance to arrive at the airport with enough energy to complete her approach, but not so much that she would overshoot the runway. Too fast, and she would float past the runway threshold with nowhere to go. Too slow, and she might stall the aircraft short of the runway with equally fatal results. Flying by feel and instinct, Sarah began a controlled descent through the cloud layer. The F-16 bucked and rolled in the turbulent air, each gust threatening to upset her carefully maintained approach profile. Without her attitude indicator, she had to rely on the pressure she felt in her seat and the view through her canopy to maintain proper aircraft orientation, assuming she could see anything through the clouds and precipitation. The weather was becoming a significant factor in its own right. What had started as scattered clouds was developing into a full-scale storm system, with heavy rain, strong winds, and dangerous wind shear that could slam her aircraft into the ground without warning. Lightning flickered ominously in the clouds around her, and she could hear the static interference it created in her dead radio headset. As she descended through 7,000 feet, the engine began to surge and sputter in earnest.
Sarah could feel the power fluctuations through the throttle, and she knew she was running out of time. The engine might quit completely at any moment, transforming her powered approach into a dead-stick gliding approach with no opportunity for a go-around if something went wrong. Through a break in the clouds, Sarah caught sight of North Las Vegas Airport. The runway appeared smaller than she had hoped, but it was there, real and concrete and achievable. She could see the rotating beacon that marked the airport's location and the parallel lines of runway lights that would guide her to safety if she could maintain control for just a few more minutes. But as she descended toward North Las Vegas Airport, Sarah realized that her challenges were far from over. Without radio contact, she had no way to coordinate with air traffic control or alert ground personnel to her emergency. The airport's controllers would see an unidentified F-16 approaching their airfield without clearance and without communication, a scenario that could trigger security responses and emergency procedures that might actually complicate her landing attempt. More immediately, she had no way to confirm that the runway was clear of other aircraft. North Las Vegas was a busy general aviation airport with dozens of aircraft operations every hour. A corporate jet or training aircraft on the runway could turn her emergency landing into a catastrophic collision. Sarah descended through 5,000 feet, still fighting to maintain control of her increasingly unresponsive aircraft. The engine was now running so roughly that she could see visible vibrations in her cockpit instruments, and she could smell something burning. Whether from her aircraft's electrical fire or from engine stress, she couldn't tell. The runway was growing larger in her windscreen, but it still looked impossibly small for a fighter jet that normally required precise approach speeds and specific runway lengths. The F-16 wasn't designed for short-field landings, and without her sophisticated flight control systems to help manage the approach, Sarah would have to rely on pure piloting skill to get her aircraft safely on the ground. As she passed through 3,000 feet, less than 3 miles from the runway, Sarah's engine finally gave up the fight. The rough running suddenly smoothed out, not because the problems had been fixed, but because the engine had quit completely. The cockpit became eerily quiet except for the whistle of wind over the canopy and the various warning tones that were somehow still managing to sound despite her electrical failures. She was now committed to landing, with no possibility of a go-around and no second chances. In the next 3 minutes, Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez would either validate every hour of training she had ever received, or she would become another statistic in the unforgiving mathematics of aviation physics.
With her engine dead and her F-16 now operating as a 16-ton glider, Sarah Martinez entered the most critical phase of what was already an impossible situation. The sudden silence in her cockpit was deafening. No engine noise, no radio chatter, just the whistle of wind over her canopy and the steady beeping of whatever warning systems were still functioning on backup power. She was now committed to a dead-stick landing approach to North Las Vegas Airport, with no instruments, no radio contact, and no chance for a go-around if anything went wrong. The physics were unforgiving. She had one opportunity to get this right, and failure meant death. The F-16, without engine power, have the gliding characteristics of a concrete block. Unlike civilian aircraft designed with good gliding ratios, the Fighting Falcon was optimized for speed and maneuverability, not for unpowered flight. Sarah estimated she could glide approximately 1.6 miles for every 1,000 feet of altitude she lost, a marginal ratio that left no room for error in her approach planning. From her current altitude of approximately 2,800 feet and distance of 2.5 miles from the runway, Sarah calculated that she was on the ragged edge of making it to the airfield. Any deviation from optimal gliding speed, any energy lost to maneuvering, or any unexpected wind conditions could leave her short of the runway with no alternatives. The weather continued to deteriorate around her, with strong crosswinds and wind shear that threatened to push her off course or slam her into the ground. Rain was beginning to streak across her canopy, reducing visibility and making it harder to judge her approach angle and distance from the runway. Lightning continued to flicker in the clouds, and Sarah could feel the aircraft buffeted by the turbulent air masses associated with the storm system.
Without her normal flight instruments, Sarah had to rely on visual cues to maintain proper approach speed and glide path. The F-16's optimal gliding speed was approximately 220 knots, but without a working airspeed indicator, she had to judge her speed by the feel of the controls and the appearance of the ground rushing past her canopy. Too fast, and she would waste energy that she couldn't afford to lose. Too slow, and the aircraft would stall, dropping her short of the runway. The runway at North Las Vegas was growing larger in her windscreen, but Sarah could see that her approach was going to be challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated. The runway was oriented east-west, and the strong winds associated with the storm system were creating a significant crosswind component that would require precise control inputs to maintain runway alignment. Crosswind landings in the F-16 required the pilot to crab the aircraft into the wind during approach, then straighten out just before touchdown to align with the runway centerline. This maneuver demanded precise timing and control authority, both of which were compromised by her hydraulic failures and lack of instruments. As she descended through 1,500 feet above ground level, Sarah could see aircraft on the ground at North Las Vegas Airport, including what appeared to be several small jets and training aircraft. The airport was active, which meant she was approaching an uncontrolled field without any coordination with air traffic control. Ground personnel and other pilots would have no advance warning of her emergency approach. The S-16's approach speed was significantly higher than anything normally seen at a general aviation airport. While civilian aircraft typically approached at 70 to 100 knots, Sarah's F-16 required at least 180 knots on final approach to maintain adequate control authority. This speed differential meant she would be overtaking any aircraft ahead of her on the approach path, creating the potential for catastrophic collisions. Sarah forced herself to focus on the immediate challenges of maintaining her glide path and airspeed while dealing with the deteriorating weather conditions. The crosswind was pushing her aircraft to the left of the runway centerline, requiring constant right rudder pressure to maintain proper tracking. Without hydraulic assistance, the control forces required were becoming physically demanding. At 1,000 feet above ground level, Sarah realized that her glide path was slightly high, a potentially fatal error in a dead-stick approach. Unlike a powered aircraft, she couldn't simply reduce throttle to increase her descent rate. Instead, she'd have to use aerodynamic techniques to steepen her approach without losing too much forward airspeed. She deployed her speed brakes, large panels that extended from the aircraft's fuselage to increase drag and steepen the descent angle. The F-16 responded immediately, the nose dropping as the aircraft began descending more rapidly toward the runway. But the speed brakes also increased the control forces required to maintain proper attitude, and Sarah could feel the strain in her arms and shoulders as she fought to maintain control. At 500 feet above ground level, the runway was clearly visible through the rain and turbulence, but Sarah could see that her approach was going to be challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated. The runway was oriented east-west, and the strong winds associated with the storm system were creating a significant crosswind component that would require precise control inputs to maintain runway alignment. Crosswind landings in the F-16 required the pilot to crab the aircraft into the wind during approach, then straighten out just before touchdown to align with the runway centerline. This maneuver demanded precise timing and control authority, both of which were compromised by her hydraulic failures and lack of instruments. At 300 feet, Sarah could see people on the ground at North Las Vegas Airport looking up at her approaching F-16. Some were pointing, others were running for cover, and a few were pulling out cell phones to record what was obviously an unusual sight at their general aviation airport. None of them knew they were witnessing one of the most challenging emergency landings ever attempted. The runway threshold was rushing toward her at nearly 200 miles per hour, and every second counted.
At 100 feet above the runway threshold of North Las Vegas Airport, Captain Sarah Martinez faced the moment that would define not just her career, but her very survival. Her F-16, now a powerless glider weighing 16 tons and moving at 185 knots, was committed to a landing approach that would have been challenging under normal circumstances and was nearly impossible given her current situation.
The crosswind was besting to nearly 30 knots, pushing her aircraft sideways as she descended toward the narrow general aviation runway. Without hydraulic assistance, maintaining the precise control inputs required for a crosswind landing was physically exhausting, and Sarah could feel her arms and shoulders burning from the constant pressure needed to keep the aircraft aligned. At 50 feet, Sarah began the critical transition from her crabbed approach to runway alignment. This maneuver, known as the kick-out, required her to simultaneously apply right rudder to point the aircraft's nose down the runway centerline while using opposite aileron to prevent the aircraft from rolling in the direction of the rudder input. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the crosswind would push her up the runway. Too late, and she would touch down sideways, likely causing the landing gear to collapse catastrophically. The runway was rushing up at her with startling speed. Unlike the long, wide military runway she was accustomed to, this general aviation strip looked impossibly narrow and short. She could see the runway numbers painted on the concrete, 07 marking the eastern end of the east-west runway, growing larger in her windscreen with each passing second. At 20 feet, Sarah executed the kick-out maneuver, applying right rudder to align the aircraft's nose with the runway centerline, while simultaneously applying left aileron to keep the wings level. The F-16 responded sluggishly due to the reduced hydraulic pressure, but it responded. For a brief moment, she was tracking straight down the runway centerline, her aircraft properly aligned for touchdown. But the crosswind hadn't finished with her yet. A sudden gust caught the F-16 just as Sarah was beginning her landing flare, pushing the aircraft back toward the left side of the runway. Without engine power to add thrust and correct the deviation, Sarah only had her remaining control authority to work with. She applied more right rudder, feeling the aircraft yaw back toward the runway centerline, but now she was running out of altitude. The concrete was less than 10 feet below her main landing gear, and she was still carrying more speed than ideal for landing. The F-16 wanted to float and ground effect, the cushion of air between the aircraft and the runway that could extend her landing distance beyond the available runway length. Sarah forced the stick forward slightly, pushing the aircraft through the ground effect and onto the runway surface. The main landing gear touched down with a jarring impact that sent shock waves through the airframe and up through her spine. The aircraft bounced once, briefly becoming airborne again before settling back onto the concrete with a second, harder impact. She was down, but the landing was far from over. The F-16 was still moving at over 150 miles per hour on a runway that was significantly shorter than what the aircraft was designed for. Without thrust reversers or drag chutes, systems that relied on electrical power she no longer had, Sarah had only her wheel brakes and aerodynamic drag to slow the 16-ton fighter jet. The nose gear settled onto the runway with another jarring impact, and Sarah immediately applied maximum braking pressure. She could feel the anti-skid system trying to prevent the wheels from locking up, but without full electrical power, even this system was operating in a degraded mode. The aircraft decelerated rapidly, but not rapidly enough for the available runway length. Through her canopy, Sarah could see the far end of the runway approaching with alarming speed. The F-16 was still moving at over 100 miles per hour with less than 2,000 feet of runway remaining. At this rate, she would either run off the end of the runway at high speed or would need to ground loop the aircraft, intentionally spinning it sideways to scrub off speed before reaching the runway's end. The ground loop maneuver was dangerous in any aircraft, but potentially catastrophic in an F-16. The landing gear wasn't designed for high side loads, and the aircraft's high center of gravity made it prone to rolling over if the maneuver was executed incorrectly. But it might be her only option to avoid shooting off the end of the runway into whatever lay beyond. With 1,500 feet of runway remaining and her speed still above 80 knots, Sarah made the decision to attempt a controlled ground loop. She applied hard left rudder while maintaining straightforward pressure on the stick, causing the aircraft to pivot sideways while continuing to move forward. The maneuver created enormous side forces on the landing gear and filled the cockpit with the sound of squealing tires and stressed metal. The F-16 spun approximately 90 degrees to the left, its nose now pointed off the side of the runway while its momentum continued to carry it forward. The combination of sideways motion and aerodynamic drag from the aircraft's broadside profile to the relative wind caused rapid deceleration. Sarah could feel the aircraft sliding sideways on the concrete, the tires smoking and leaving black marks on the runway surface. With 500 feet of runway remaining, the F-16 finally came to a complete stop, sitting crossways on the runway with its nose pointed toward the airport terminal building. Steam rose from the overheated brakes, and the smell of burned rubber and hot metal filled the cockpit.
For a moment, Sarah sat motionless in her ejection seat, hardly believing that she was alive and on the ground. Her hands were shaking from adrenaline and physical exhaustion, and she could feel sweat dripping inside her flight helmet despite the cool desert air. She had just accomplished something that most pilots would have considered impossible, landing a completely disabled F-16 on a short civilian runway without instruments, radio contact, or engine power. But even as the reality of her survival began to sink in, Sarah knew that her ordeal was far from over. She was sitting in a damaged military aircraft on an active civilian runway, with emergency responders undoubtedly racing toward her location, and a host of questions that would need to be answered about how and why one of the Air Force's frontline fighters had ended up at North Las Vegas Airport. The first emergency responders to reach Sarah's F-16 were the North Las Vegas Airport Fire Department, their red trucks screaming across the tarmac with sirens wailing and emergency lights flashing. The sight that greeted them was unlike anything they had trained for. A disabled military fighter jet sitting sideways on their runway, steam rising from its landing gear and the acrid smell of burned rubber and overheated metal hanging in the desert air. Sarah remained in her cockpit for several minutes after landing, following standard procedures for emergency situations. She completed her post-flight emergency checklist, shutting down any remaining systems and ensuring that the aircraft was as safe as possible before egress. Her hands continued to shake from the adrenaline that was still coursing through her system, and she took several deep breaths to steady herself before beginning the process of climbing out of the ejection seat. The airport fire chief, a veteran of 20 years in emergency response, approached the aircraft cautiously. Military jets were outside his normal experience, and he wasn't sure what procedures to follow or what dangers the disabled F-16 might pose. The aircraft was clearly damaged. Scorch marks were visible around some of the access panels, and the landing gear struts showed signs of stress from the hard landing and ground loop maneuver. "Ma'am, are you injured?" the fire chief called up to Sarah as she began the process of disconnecting her life support systems and preparing to exit the aircraft. "Negative," Sarah replied, her voice hoarse from the stress of the emergency landing. "Aircraft is shut down and should be safe to approach. I need to contact Nellis Air Force Base immediately to report my status." Within minutes, the quiet General Aviation Airport was transformed into a hub of activity. Military personnel from Nellis began arriving, along with representatives from the FAA, accident investigators, and members of the media who had heard reports of an F-16 emergency landing. The runway was closed to all other traffic, stranding several civilian aircraft that had been scheduled to land. Colonel Thompson arrived at North Las Vegas Airport 30 minutes after Sarah's landing, his face showing a mixture of relief and amazement. When he had last heard from Sarah, she had been 40 miles away and dealing with multiple system failures. The fact that she had managed to fly a completely disabled aircraft to a successful landing seemed almost impossible. "Captain Martinez," Thompson said as Sarah finally climbed down from her aircraft, her legs unsteady after the physical and mental stress of the emergency. "What's your status? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, sir," Sarah replied, pulling off her helmet and running her hand through sweat-dampened hair. "Aircraft suffered complete electrical and hydraulic failure, followed by engine failure. I managed to glide to this airport and execute an emergency landing." Thompson looked at the F-16, taking in the evidence of the catastrophic systems failures and the challenging landing. The aircraft would obviously require extensive investigation and repair, but the important thing was that his pilot was alive and uninjured. "How did you manage to navigate here without instruments or radio contact?" "Visual navigation and dead reckoning, sir.
I used Interstate 15 and the Las Vegas skyline as reference points, then identified this airport as the closest suitable landing site when my engine failed. As the initial emergency response evolved into a formal investigation, the remarkable nature of Sarah's achievement began to become clear. Accident investigators found that she had suffered not just one or two system failures, but a cascade of interconnected failures that had left her aircraft essentially unflyable by normal standards. The electrical fire had destroyed most of her flight instruments, navigation systems, and communication equipment. The hydraulic failures had made the aircraft extremely difficult to control. The engine failure had removed any possibility of a go-around or powered approach. The combination of failures was unprecedented in F-16 operations. Most emergency procedures assume that pilots would have at least some functioning systems to work with. Sarah had successfully landed an aircraft that most experts would have considered uncontrollable. News of the emergency landing spread quickly through military aviation circles. Within hours, Sarah was receiving calls from pilots around the world who wanted to understand how she had managed to accomplish what many considered impossible. The landing was being compared to famous aviation emergencies, like Captain Sullenberger's landing on the Hudson River or the Gimli glider incident. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from her own squadron. The pilots who had questioned her abilities, who had suggested she lacked the killer instinct necessary for fighter aviation, were forced to confront the reality of what she had accomplished. Captain Stevens, who had often excluded her from informal discussions, was one of the first to seek her out. "Phoenix," he said, using her call sign with the respect that had been absent before, "I owe you an apology. What you did today, I'm not sure any of us could have pulled that off." Captain Johnson, who had been her element lead during the training mission, was more direct in his assessment. "That was the most impressive piece of flying I've ever seen," he told the gathering crowd of pilots who had come to hear Sarah's account of the emergency. "She saved not only her own life, but probably the lives of civilians on the ground. That aircraft could have crashed into populated areas if she hadn't maintained control." Even Colonel Thompson, who had been the most vocal skeptic of Sarah's abilities, was forced to acknowledge what she had accomplished. Captain Martinez demonstrated exceptional airmanship under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Her performance reflects the highest standards of military aviation and serves as an example of the skill and dedication we expect from all our pilots. The investigation into the aircraft systems failures revealed that the cascade of problems had been caused by a manufacturing defect in an electrical wire harness, a flaw so rare that it had never been encountered before in operational F-16s. The failure was not due to any error or oversight on Sarah's part, but rather a one-in-a-million combination of circumstances that had created the perfect storm of systems failures. As Sarah sat in the debriefing room at Nellis Air Force Base that evening, surrounded by accident investigators, fellow pilots, and senior officers, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The skepticism and doubt she had faced throughout her career had been painful, but it had also forged her into the kind of pilot who could handle the impossible when the impossible became necessary.
6 months after her miraculous emergency landing at North Las Vegas Airport, Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at the Air Force Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base. She had been invited to speak about her experience as part of a symposium on emergency procedures and human factors in aviation, but her presence there represented something far more significant than a simple case study in crisis management. The investigation into her aircraft's failures had concluded with recommendations for design changes that would prevent similar cascading system failures in the future. The rare electrical fault that had triggered her emergency had led to modifications in wire harness routing and additional redundancy in critical flight systems. Sarah's experience had literally made aviation safer for future generations of pilots. But the personal vindication was perhaps even more meaningful than the technical contributions. The same officers who had questioned her competence were now citing her emergency landing as an example of exceptional airmanship. The squadron that had once treated her as an outsider was now holding her up as a standard of excellence.
The Air Force that had sometimes seemed reluctant to fully embrace female fighter pilots was now showcasing her achievement as proof that capability knew no gender boundaries. The question I'm asked most often, Sarah told the audience of test pilots, flight instructors, and aviation safety experts, is how I remained calm during those critical minutes when everything was going wrong. The truth is, I wasn't calm. I was terrified. But terror and panic are two different things, and my training taught me to channel fear into focused action. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, showing a photograph of her F-16 as it sat disabled on the North Las Vegas runway. This landing wasn't accomplished by some superhuman ability or innate talent. It was the result of thousands of hours of training, countless simulations of emergency procedures, and the accumulated knowledge of every instructor who ever pushed me to be better than I thought I could be. The audience listened intently as Sarah walked them through the technical aspects of her emergency, the system failures, the decision-making process, the energy management calculations that had guided her approach. But she also spoke about the psychological challenges, the isolation of flying alone with no radio contact, the pressure of knowing that any mistake would be fatal, and the way that years of skepticism and doubt had actually prepared her for a moment when there was nowhere to hide. Every time someone questioned whether I belonged in a fighter cockpit, she said, they were forcing me to examine my own capabilities and commitment. Every time I had to prove myself again, I was building the mental resilience that I needed when everything went wrong at once. The doubt that others expressed became the determination that kept me fighting to save my aircraft and my life. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by a group of young female cadets from the Air Force Academy. They had driven out from Colorado Springs specifically to hear her speak, and their questions revealed the challenges they were facing as they pursued their own dreams of military aviation careers. Did you ever think about quitting? When people kept questioning your abilities, did you ever wonder if maybe they were right? Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. There were moments when I questioned everything, my abilities, my choices, whether the fight was worth it. But I realized doubt from others only has power if you let it become doubt in yourself. The key is to use that external skepticism as fuel for internal determination. She looked at each of the young women in turn. The truth is, you'll probably face similar challenges. Some people will question whether you belong in combat aircraft, whether you have what it takes, whether you're tough enough or skilled enough or committed enough. But here's what I learned. Those questions aren't really about you. They're about other people's assumptions and limitations. Your job isn't to convince them. It's to prove to yourself that you belong wherever your skills and dedication can take you. One of the cadets, a young woman from Texas who reminded Sarah of herself at that age, asked about the technical aspects of the emergency landing. How did you know you could make it to the airport without instruments? How do you calculate something like that when everything is failing? You don't calculate it, Sarah replied with a slight smile. You make your best estimate based on training and experience, and then you commit completely to making it work. There's a point in any emergency where analysis has to give way to action. I knew I probably had enough altitude and airspeed to reach North Las Vegas Airport, but probably was the best I could do with the information available. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from the physics of dead-stick landings to the psychology of emergency decision-making. But Sarah found herself most energized by the enthusiasm and determination she saw in these young women. They represented the future of military aviation, a future where capability would matter more than gender, where excellence would be recognized regardless of who achieved it. Later that evening, Sarah received a phone call that brought her career full circle. Colonel Thompson, her former squadron commander, who had once questioned her killer instinct, was calling to offer her a position as an instructor pilot at the Air Force's premier fighter weapons school. "Phoenix, we want you to help train the next generation of fighter pilots. Your emergency landing has become a case study in airmanship, but more than that, you've demonstrated the kind of thinking and determination we want to instill in every pilot who goes through our program." The offer represented everything Sarah had worked toward. Recognition not just as a competent pilot, but as an exceptional one whose skills and judgment were valued by the Air Force's most demanding programs. It was vindication not just of her abilities, but of her right to be judged by the same standards as any other pilot. "I'd be honored to accept," Sarah replied, thinking about those young cadets and all the future pilots who would benefit from training that emphasized capability over preconceptions. 6 months later, instructor pilot Sarah Martinez stood in front of her first class of student fighter pilots at Nellis Air Force Base. The class was diverse: men and women, officers from different backgrounds, pilots with varying levels of experience, but they all shared one thing in common. They were there to learn from someone who had proven herself under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Emergency procedures, Sarah began her first lecture, aren't just about memorizing checklists and practicing simulated failures. They're about developing the mental framework to handle situations that aren't in any manual, to make life or death decisions with incomplete information, and to never give up when the odds seem impossible. She clicked to a slide showing her F-16 on the runway at North Las Vegas Airport. This aircraft was declared unflyable by every technical expert who examined it after my landing. The combination of failures I experienced shouldn't have been survivable, but it was, because training and determination can overcome technical limitations when they have to. The students listened intently, knowing they were learning from someone who had faced the ultimate test and prevailed. In the back of the classroom, Colonel Thompson observed the lesson with satisfaction. The pilot he had once doubted had become exactly the kind of instructor the Air Force needed. Someone who could teach not just the technical aspects of flying, but the mental toughness required to succeed when everything went wrong. As Sarah continued her lecture, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the skepticism she had faced, the doubt she had overcome, and the impossible landing that had changed everything. Every challenge had been a test, and every test had made her stronger. "The most important thing I can teach you," she told her students, "is that your capabilities aren't defined by other people's expectations. They're defined by your willingness to push beyond what you think is possible, to train harder than seems necessary, and to never accept that something can't be done just because it's never been done before." In the end, Sarah Martinez had done more than land a disabled F-16 on a civilian runway. She had proven that excellence recognizes no boundaries, that skill and determination matter more than gender or background, and that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them head-on and refusing to surrender. Her emergency landing had lasted only minutes, but its impact would be felt for generations in the design improvements that made aircraft safer, in the training programs that better prepared pilots for the impossible, and in the careers of countless aviators who would follow her path into the cockpit of America's most advanced fighters.
Captain Sarah Phoenix Martinez had earned her place in aviation history not by seeking attention or recognition, but by doing what she had always done, proving that she belonged exactly where she was, one flight at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.